Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is the really remarkable narrative arc of Billy Byrne. His early life, it's deeply rooted in Chicago's West Side, and it reads like a catalog of escalating crime, from minor stuff like rushing the can at 6 to much more serious things like robbing freight cars and organized strong-arm work. But then this trajectory is just violently interrupted by these extreme experiences, shipwreck, captivity, profound relationships, which seem to spur this really radical personal change.
And that sudden, pretty dramatic shift is, that's the core of what we're digging into. We're asking, essentially, whether Billy Byrne's transformation from that known mucker identity to a man who seems capable of real honor, even self-sacrifice, represents a genuine, fundamental, and crucially internalized moral evolution. Or, is it maybe the other way around? Is this shift just, a change in external behavior, really dependent on intense situational pressure, and maybe most importantly, his specific kind of situational devotion to another person?
Right. And I'll be arguing that the evidence points pretty strongly towards a transformation that is fundamental, it's internalized, it's permanent, and I think it's proven by actions he takes that go directly against his deeply ingrained nature and everything he's known his whole life.
Okay, and I'm going to approach it from a slightly different angle. I'll argue the change is largely, maybe, an externally imposed framework. It seems unstable because of that, and ultimately, I think it's constrained and, frankly, defeated by these deep sociological and psychological barriers that, he just could never truly overcome.
Well, look, the journey towards fundamental change, I think it begins almost physically. Consider his survival of the captain's repeated, just horrific beatings. The source material calls these near-fatal ordeals unrecorded miracles of the power of matter over mind. Now that suggests an almost physical tempering, right? An initial resilience that kind of sets the stage for a moral difference later. But more substantively, his conversion, I think, is really cemented by a moment of genuine shame, not just devotion. His actions on Yoka, especially after Barbara Harding's very open disgust when he, brutally kicked an unconscious man, that led him to recognize his earlier crime against Mallory as a brutal, cowardly thing. Now that realization feels like an internal moral establishment. It's a genuine acquisition of new values, like true courage, honor, which he even admits he is just a learning of the right kind of nerve. This shows the transformation is deep-seated, I think, regardless of where he came from.
That's a compelling point about the initial moral trigger. I see that. But I'd frame let's say, the sustained effort a bit differently. We really have to acknowledge that his motivation, especially early on, seems quite external and reactive. Think about his relationship with Barbara Harding itself. He hates her at first, doesn't he? He actively resents her perfection because it just magnifies his own flaws, and it solidifies her status as representing, quote, that loathed element of society. So when he later performs these heroic actions, the text itself repeatedly, very explicitly, ties his internal commitment to that external sort of reminding slogan, for her sake. Now, to me, that sounds like external devotion acting as a very effective, sure, but ultimately conditional mechanism for behavior control. It feels like a framework built around her approval, not some self-generated, stable ethical code. And crucially, that old persona, it's never really gone. His mucker identity seems suppressed, maybe, but it's readily available for a tactical deployment. We see that with his calculated bank robbery done in Mexico, which he kind of justifies using the rhetoric of war and nicking their resources. That strategic criminal mindset, it seems like it's still there.
Okay, I hear your argument about the role of external validation, I do, but I find that explanation a bit difficult to sustain when we look at the immediate, almost principled-based shift that's triggered by shame. The turning point isn't really setting up a romantic attachment. It feels like genuine moral shame leading to an immediate change in principle. When Barbara witnesses his brutality and calls him a brutal menace, the narrative really emphasizes that he thinks for the very first time of how he appeared in the eyes of another. Now, that instant cognitive shift, which happens before any deep romantic feelings really take hold, leads to this immediate and seemingly unwavering internal resolve: never strike a woman again. This act of defining a core internal moral limit, triggered by shame, yes, but then rigorously enacted by willpower, that feels like the definitive hallmark of fundamental character formation. It overrides decades of ingrained cynical brutality. It establishes a moral boundary completely independent of whether or not he ever wins her affection.
The problem, though, is that morality established under duress and maybe reinforced by acute shame often struggles to sustain itself without those original pressure points, right? I mean, the initial dramatic change happens during these really extraordinary circumstances. The shipwreck, the captivity, where social roles were completely inverted, and he was sort of forced into this protective identity. So while he may have felt shame, yes, the subsequent long-term actions, including rescuing Harding and Mallory, they are still framed by that external banner, that for her sake. If the moral code were truly internalized, meaning if he valued nobility purely for its own sake, that explicit, self-reminding dependence on an external object, well, it just wouldn't seem necessary. It kind of confirms that the structure of his new morality is more like a duty derived from an object of devotion.
And that suggests the integrity of his moral compass is conditional, somehow tied to her proximity or her perceived approval.
But couldn't the very adoption of that duty become the new internal compass? Isn't the conscious decision to subscribe to chivalry, to actively choose honor, what defines the transformation? And look, if we look later in the story, we see him making conscious moral choices that actively reject his past, even when his survival instincts are screaming at him to do otherwise. After he escapes from jail in Chicago, he's got the deputy sheriff subdued. He looks at the man and consciously decides not to croak him, specifically saying he doesn't want to be a murderer. Now that's a moment of pure voluntary moral definition, isn't it? Where he actively chooses what he calls the best in true manhood over the easy violence that defined his past.
Well, I'm not quite convinced that one moment of refusing to commit murder really negates the deep-seated persistence of his old identity. I mean, I'd submit that the old persona isn't discarded. It's simply repurposed. It becomes a functional reservoir of skills. When he escapes imprisonment, he does use violence and threat. That's the immediate resource he falls back on to subdue the deputy and get free. He might have exercised restraint in not taking a life, sure, but the method itself, that's still steeped in his street skills.
Wait, but that is precisely the difference. He's leveraging his skills, yes, his tactical thinking, his physical ability, but he places them in service of a moral boundary. He uses the tools of a fighter, maybe, but not the morality of a murderer. That's the change.
Yet, just consider the transition down in Mexico. He seamlessly slips into the persona of Captain Byrne, uses his fighting skills, and commits calculated large-scale financial crime, that bank robbery, which he explicitly justifies to bridge with the rhetoric of war, right? Nicking their resources. His ability to switch instantly between the refined gentleman and the efficient, brutal, strategic fighter, it confirms that the old persona isn't gone. It's just waiting for the right moment, or maybe the convenient justification to pop back up. Look at the incident with the Malay savage. He kills efficiently, brutally, and then he's genuinely horrified by Barbara's pure visceral reaction to the inherent, savageness of the act. That horror, I think, stems from the realization that he is still capable of that base violence, even if it was performed in defense.
But we have to distinguish between retaining useful skills and retaining a criminal moral identity. The very fact that he is ashamed by Barbara's reaction demonstrates that his internal standard has shifted. And furthermore, you're overlooking the intellectual aspiration, which I think proves this transformation is fundamental and comprehensive. He actively starts to appreciate high culture. You know, the poetry of Bridge, Nibs, Kipling. He finds that this material gets you and me in the same way. Now that's a profoundly important moment, I believe, because it represents him intellectually moving past that self-limiting class barrier. He's realizing that culture, feeling, these things are universal. It elevates his self-perception way beyond the sissy stereotype he once held for high society. These internal intellectual aspirations are clear evidence of a genuine desire to occupy a higher moral and, yes, social sphere.
Okay, that's a powerful argument for aspiration, I grant you. But aspiration and actual integration are two very different things. If this transformation were truly fundamental, wouldn't it have integrated him socially and emotionally?
Instead, look at his final desperate emotional crisis, the moment when he feels that class barrier most intensely. What does he do? He reverts to the most base form of class rage. He literally throws money at Barbara, reflecting this deep-seated sense of injustice and inadequacy. And then, he storms out the servants' door, physically and symbolically retreating right back to his origins. This reversion to base instincts at the moment of highest emotional tension, it demonstrates pretty clearly, I think, that the core psychological shift needed to overcome that class identity never fully took root. The mucker is still the emotional fallback position.
But the final test of character is always the ultimate self-sacrifice, isn't it? And here I argue the transformation is proven complete because it overrides self-interest and that base emotional response. He chooses a noble retreat. He voluntarily ensures Barbara's long-term happiness by actively pushing her toward Mallory, the very man he previously almost destroyed. He does this because he recognizes Mallory is, quote, her kind, a true gentleman. That shows a depth of love and selflessness that utterly transcends his ego, his physical desires. The truly selfish man, the original mucker, would have demanded her presence or tried to force the relationship somehow. But Billy's resolve to live straight so she won't be ashamed of him, his thought, if she ever hears of Billy Byrne again, it won't be anything to make her ashamed. That is the defining act of chivalry. It proves his character has been fundamentally refined, because he prioritizes her happiness over his own intense personal love. That choice feels like an internal moral victory, pure and simple.
Conversely, though, I'd argue that this very self-rejection is the ultimate proof of the failure to achieve a fundamental transformation. His decision to remove himself isn't rooted in nobility, perhaps, but in his own tragic, persistent feeling of inadequacy. It's perfectly encapsulated in that heartbreaking statement he makes that a single lifetime is far too short for a man to cover the distance from Grand Avenue to Riverside Drive. Now that quote doesn't sound like chivalry to me. It sounds like resigned defeat against those class barriers. It illustrates the collapse of his internal struggle. So his rejection of Barbara, I think it's rooted in the deep-seated feeling that he is still fundamentally just a mucker who can never truly belong in her world. If the transformation had been truly fundamental, wouldn't he have believed in the power of his new character to bridge that chasm? The very necessity of physically removing himself from her life, rather than finding a way to integrate his new identity into some kind of shared future, suggests a change was never comprehensive enough to alter his core self-perception, or indeed overcome those external sociological constraints.
So we've explored the undeniable and, I think, profound internal changes. The acquisition of honor, the self-imposed rejection of murder, those intellectual aspirations towards a higher culture, and ultimately, the capacity for that ultimate selfless sacrifice. These points, for me, strongly suggest Billy Byrne achieved a fundamental moral evolution, moving far beyond his criminal origins.
And yet, we can't ignore the constraints that seem to have limited this transformation. The consistent, quite explicit reliance on external validation, that for her sake motto. The continuous tactical persistence of his West Side skill set. And maybe most critically, his profound self-imposed removal based on that acknowledged, internalized sense of an unbridgeable chasm between classes.
Yeah, the material really forces us to weigh the significance of these noble, self-sacrificing actions, which seem to be the choices of a profoundly changed man, against the clear evidence of his own persistent, deeply ingrained identity struggles, and maybe the societal limitations he ultimately felt were just insurmountable.
The richness of this whole narrative lies precisely in that tension, doesn't it? A powerful, clearly sincere transformation that adopted a new framework of honor, but one which may still have been too constrained by, external reality and perhaps his own internal self-perception to be called a complete and lasting moral rebirth. There's clearly much more to unpack in Billy Byrne's struggle for a true identity.